It is 1943. Somewhere over the Solomon Islands, the sky is on fire. A Japanese Zero pilot spots something closing on him from above. It is moving impossibly fast, diving at nearly 400 miles per hour. He pulls hard. He banks. He prays. It does not matter. The bent-wing silhouette drops through the clouds like a falling hawk. Before the Zero's pilot can react, 6 Browning machine guns tear the morning apart. The Americans called it the Corsair. The Japanese called it Whistling Death. By the time the Second World War ended, this single aircraft had compiled 2,140 confirmed aerial kills. Its kill ratio against Japanese aircraft was more than 11-1. This is the story of the F4U Corsair, the most powerful, the most feared, and perhaps the most remarkable American fighter aircraft ever built. To understand why the Corsair mattered, you need to understand the world it was built for. By the late 1930s, war clouds were gathering across Europe and the Pacific. The United States Navy watched with growing concern as Imperial Japan expanded its reach across Asia and the Western Pacific. American naval planners understood that any coming conflict in the Pacific would not be decided on the ocean's surface alone. It would be decided in the skies above it. Carrier aviation would be the deciding factor, and that meant the Navy needed a new breed of fighter. In 1938, the Bureau of Aeronautics issued a requirement for a new carrier-based fighter. It had to be faster than anything currently in service. It needed to carry heavier armament, and it had to survive the brutal punishment of combat thousands of miles from the nearest friendly airfield. Vought Aircraft responded with a bold proposal. Chief designer Rex Beisel and his team made a critical decision early on. They would build the airframe around the largest, most powerful aviation engine available at the time. That engine was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. It was an 18-cylinder radial engine producing an astonishing 2,000 horsepower. But that engine created a problem. To extract maximum power from it, the Corsair needed an enormous propeller, 13 feet and 4 inches in diameter. That propeller, sitting at the nose of the aircraft, had to clear the ground during takeoff and landing. Standard landing gear was simply not tall enough. Beisel's solution was unconventional, and it would define the aircraft's character forever. He bent the wings. By incorporating an inverted gull wing design, bending down sharply from the fuselage before sweeping back up and outward, engineers could use shorter and stronger landing gear while still clearing that massive propeller. The result was a silhouette unlike anything else in the sky. Functional, unique, instantly recognizable. The Corsair first flew on May 29, 1940. Test pilot Lyman Bullard pushed it to 405 miles per hour. That made it the first American fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight. The Navy was impressed. Then came the complications. The Corsair was extraordinary in the air. On the deck of a carrier, it was something else entirely. Early testing revealed a dangerous problem. The long nose, necessary to accommodate that massive engine, severely restricted the pilot's forward visibility during landing approaches. Carrier landings require a pilot to see the deck clearly at all times. The Corsair made that nearly impossible. There was another issue. The aircraft had a tendency to bounce hard on touchdown. On a carrier deck, a bounce meant going over the side. The starboard wing also had a lift characteristic that could cause a sudden roll at low speeds, precisely when a pilot was most vulnerable on approach. In 1942, after extensive testing, the United States Navy made a decision that seemed, at the time, like a death sentence for the program. The F4U Corsair would not be cleared for carrier operations. For an aircraft designed specifically for carrier service, that was a stunning verdict. But the Navy had alternatives. The F-6F Hellcat was already in development, and it handled carrier operations with far less difficulty. The Corsair was redirected to the United States Marine Corps, and in that redirection, history was quietly made. The Marines did not need carrier clearance. They operated from land bases, rough improvised airstrips carved out of Pacific islands, places like Guadalcanal's Henderson Field, where the runway was pierced steel matting laid over mud, and Japanese bombers arrived on a nightly basis. The Corsair's weaknesses did not matter as much there. Its strengths mattered enormously: speed, range, firepower, toughness. The first Marine squadron to fly the Corsair in combat was VMF-124. They arrived in the Pacific in early 1943. Their first real test came on February 14, 1943, a date that would become known among Corsair crews as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Not for what the Corsair did to the enemy, for what the enemy did to them. Escorting a formation of B-24 Liberator bombers over Guadalcanal, VMF-124 encountered a massive formation of Japanese Zero fighters. The Marines had the aircraft. They did not yet have the tactics. They had not yet learned how to use the Corsair's advantages while avoiding its weaknesses against the Zero. They lost 8 aircraft. The bombers took heavy casualties. It was a brutal lesson. But the Marine Corps learned fast. In the weeks and months that followed, Marine Corsair pilots developed tactics that would transform aerial combat in the Pacific. The first lesson was this: never fight a Zero on its own terms. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was, in many respects, a masterpiece of aircraft design. It was light, highly maneuverable, and had exceptional range that shocked American planners when the war began. In a turning fight at low speed, a skilled Zero pilot could outmaneuver almost anything the Americans could put in the sky, but the Zero achieved its agility through sacrifice. To save weight, its designers eliminated armor protection for the pilot and removed self-sealing fuel tanks. The Zero could turn tightly. It could not take punishment. The Corsair was the opposite. It was heavy, powerful, and rugged, built to absorb combat damage and keep flying. Its 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns could destroy an enemy aircraft in a single burst, and its speed was the key to everything. Marine pilots learned to use altitude as a weapon. They would climb above the engagement, select a target, push into a dive, reach speeds the Zero simply could not match, make their firing pass, and use that built-up energy to climb back out of range before the enemy could respond. Hit and run, dive and climb. Energy tactics rather than turning fights. The results began to change. Then came the man who would become the Corsair's most famous pilot. Major Gregory Boyington was, by any conventional measure, a complicated figure. He had already resigned his Marine Corps commission once. He had flown briefly as a mercenary with the American volunteer group in China, the famous Flying Tigers. When he returned to the Marines, he was broke, restless, and determined to prove something. In September 1943, Boyington was given command of VMF-214. The squadron was hastily assembled from replacement pilots with little experience and no established identity. He called them the Black Sheep. What followed was one of the most remarkable combat records in Marine Corps aviation history. Boyington pushed his pilots relentlessly. He taught them tactics, built their confidence, and demanded aggression in every engagement. And he led by example, placing himself in the most dangerous position every time they flew. The Black Sheep became a byword for ferocity over the Solomon Islands. In just 84 days of combat operations during their first tour, VMF-214 was credited with destroying 94 enemy aircraft. Boyington himself had accumulated 26 aerial victories by January 1944. That tied the World War I record held by Eddie Rickenbacker. On January 3, 1944, during a massive air battle over Rabaul, the heavily fortified Japanese base on New Britain, Boyington was shot down. He survived. He would endure nearly 2 years as a prisoner of war in Japanese captivity before being liberated when the war ended. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. He was the living by late 1943. The strategic picture in the Pacific was shifting. American forces had won a brutal, grinding victory at Guadalcanal. The next phase called for neutralizing Rabaul. Rabaul was the massive Japanese base that served as the anchor of Imperial Japan's defensive perimeter in the South Pacific. It was formidably defended. The Japanese had concentrated hundreds of aircraft there, along with a powerful naval force and tens of thousands of troops. American planners initially considered a direct invasion. That operation would have been extraordinarily costly in lives. Instead, they chose air power. Beginning in October 1943, the United States launched a sustained aerial campaign against Rabaul of unprecedented scale. Corsairs, Hellcats, and Army Air Force's P-38 Lightnings flew mission after mission. They engaged Japanese fighters in massive air battles that sometimes involved hundreds of aircraft at once. The Corsair proved indispensable. Its range, which was greater than many of its contemporaries, allowed it to escort bombers deep into enemy airspace that other fighters simply could not reach. Its speed and firepower gave it the edge in the turning, climbing, diving chaos of large engagements. Embodiment of everything the Corsair represented: defiant, powerful, damaged, and ultimately unbreakable. By late 1943, the strategic picture in the Pacific was shifting. American forces had won a brutal, grinding victory at Guadalcanal. The next phase called for neutralizing Rabaul. Rabaul was the massive Japanese base that served as the anchor of Imperial Japan's defensive perimeter in the South Pacific. It was formidably defended. The Japanese had concentrated hundreds of aircraft there, along with a powerful naval force and tens of thousands of troops. American planners initially considered a direct invasion. That operation would have been extraordinarily costly in lives. Instead, they chose air power. Beginning in October 1943, the United States launched a sustained aerial campaign against Rabaul of unprecedented scale. Corsairs, Hellcats, and Army Air Force's P-38 Lightnings flew mission after mission. They engaged Japanese fighters in massive air battles that sometimes involved hundreds of aircraft at once. The Corsair proved indispensable. Its range, which was greater than many of its contemporaries, allowed it to escort bombers deep into enemy airspace that other fighters simply could not reach. Its speed and firepower gave it the edge in the turning, climbing, diving chaos of large engagements. Japanese aviators were formidable opponents. Many of the pilots defending Rabaul were veterans of the early Pacific campaigns, men who had been flying in combat since before Pearl Harbor. Against them, American pilots had to be skilled, disciplined, and tactically precise. The losses on both sides were severe, but the mathematics of attrition were working against Japan. The United States had industrial production on a scale that Imperial Japan simply could not match. When America lost a Corsair, a replacement was on a ship from the West Coast within weeks. When Japan lost a Zero, and increasingly when Japan lost the irreplaceable trained pilot inside it, the gap was felt immediately and painfully. By early 1944, Japanese air strength over Rabaul had been broken. The once mighty base was effectively neutralized without a ground invasion. That was a landmark moment in the history of strategic air power. The Corsair had been at the center of it. The story of the Corsair's rejection from carrier duty did not end in 1942. The British Royal Navy, operating Corsairs under the Lend-Lease program, identified the problems with carrier landings and worked to solve them. By raising the pilot's seat several inches, the forward visibility problem was significantly reduced. The British Fleet Air Arm began operating Corsairs from carriers in 1943, developing approaches and techniques that worked with the aircraft's characteristics. The Americans were paying close attention. By late 1944, the United States Navy had revised its procedures, modified the aircraft, and cleared the Corsair for carrier operations. After 2 years flying from jungle airstrips, the bent-wing fighter finally went to sea. And it arrived just in time for the most intense aerial combat of the entire Pacific War. The campaigns for Iwo Jima and Okinawa brought a new and terrifying dimension to the conflict: the kamikaze. Japanese High Command, recognizing that conventional aerial combat was producing unsustainable losses, had authorized a desperate strategy. Pilots would fly their aircraft loaded with explosives directly into American ships. These were not attacks in the conventional sense. They were deliberate sacrifices, and they were extraordinarily effective. At Okinawa alone, kamikaze strikes sank 36 American ships and damaged hundreds more. The defense of the fleet against kamikaze required fast, heavily armed fighters capable of intercepting suicide aircraft before they reached the ships. The Corsair was ideal for that role. Flying combat air patrol over the fleet, Corsair pilots developed new tactics for intercepting fast, low-flying kamikaze formations. The work was relentless, emotionally draining, and desperately important. Every aircraft a Corsair pilot shot down was potentially a ship saved, and potentially hundreds of American sailors still alive. As American forces moved toward the Japanese home islands, Corsairs flew close air support missions. They attacked fortifications, airfields, and supply lines. The aircraft's ability to carry bombs, rockets, and incendiary weapons made it a versatile and devastating ground attack platform as well. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Corsair had flown more than 64,000 combat sorties. Its pilots had claimed 2,140 aerial victories. The kill ratio against Japanese aircraft was approximately 11.3 to 1. No other American single-engine aircraft of the Second World War could match that record. The war ended. The Corsair did not. Remarkably, for an aircraft designed in the late 1930s, the F4U Corsair remained in frontline service well into the following decade. During the Korean War, Corsairs flew close air support missions for United Nations ground forces. That was nearly 10 years after the aircraft's first flight. In an era when jet aircraft were beginning to dominate warfare, the Corsair's low-speed handling and heavy weapons load still made it valuable. The last combat sorties flown by Corsairs in military service came during the football war between El Salvador and Honduras in 1969. That made the F4U Corsair one of the last propeller-driven fighters ever to see combat in the jet age. But the Corsair's legacy is not measured only in the length of its service. The story of the Corsair carries lessons that go far beyond aviation history. The aircraft was rejected, adapted, and ultimately vindicated. The Marines who flew it in the dark, early days of the Pacific War, when the outcome was far from certain and losses were severe, took an imperfect machine and made it legendary through skill, courage, and tactical ingenuity. The industrial achievement behind the Corsair is also worth recognizing. More than 12,500 F4U aircraft were produced during the war years. That number was a testament to the mobilized production capacity of American industry that Japan's leadership had feared from the moment they decided to attack Pearl Harbor. The pilots who flew it came from every corner of America: farm boys from Kansas, city kids from Chicago, college students whose studies were interrupted by the attack on Pearl Harbor. They were young, most of them, frighteningly young. and they climbed into powerful, demanding machines and flew them into mortal danger with a professionalism that still commands respect more than 80 years later. Today, if you visit an air show, there is a moment you will not forget. You hear it before you see it. A deep, rhythmic thunder that is unlike any other sound in aviation. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp at full power. Veterans of the Pacific have described that sound as instantly transporting them back across 8 decades of memory. Then, the bent wing silhouette appears, low and fast, and for just a moment, you can almost understand what it felt like to see it diving out of the Pacific sky. Or, if you were on the other side, what it might have felt like to see it coming for you. The F4U Corsair was not simply an aircraft. It was an argument made in aluminum and thundering horsepower. An argument about what was possible when engineering ambition met industrial determination and human courage. It was rejected, and it endured. It was feared, and it prevailed. It was flown by men who were ordinary in peacetime and became extraordinary in war. The numbers tell part of the story. 2,140 kills, an 11-to-1 kill ratio, 64,000 combat sorties, a record unmatched by any single-engine American aircraft of the Second World War. But numbers never tell the whole story. The whole story lives in the sound of that engine at an air show, in the memories of old men who still sometimes wake in the night with the Pacific sky alive around them, in the bent-wing silhouette that became, for an entire generation of young Americans, the shape of something both terrifying and necessary. The Corsair's war is long over. Its place in history is permanent.